What's going on, everybody? My name is Will Ash, and this is my behind the scenes for my new album, Rebirth. I wanted to do this for a couple of reasons. Rebirth has been an incredibly exciting process for me as an artist, and if you're a musician yourself, or just a listener, I wanted to share some of my thought processes going through each song and give you a little bit of background on how I recorded them and what it means to track on real tape. So let's start with a little bit of an introduction. What is Rebirth? Well, if you're in the future from when I'm recording this, Rebirth is already out. It comes out on March 20th, 2023. And Rebirth is my first fully independent record. You may know me from another project called The Remnant, which is my band project that I do that is more of a hard rock, metal kind of thing. And I've been doing that for a couple of years, put out 3 albums, which you can find on Spotify. And it's a project that's very near and dear to my heart. But sometime in 2021, I had some thoughts going on in my head. I worked with my band in a few studios to put out these records. We produced things with multiple sound engineers, different guys on deck. We had a whole team of hired people for every album, and they were always different. So I have some experience in the studio life, as well as recording albums not on my own and sending them to be mixed and mastered to other people. And we're gonna go over that process and what it's like for me here, because Rebirth is my first fully independent record. It's the first album where I took control over all of the independent processes going on with music. So let's bring you guys up to speed if you're not familiar with it. This is how I kind of break down the process of creating an album. It all starts with writing the songs. So you have to write the songs. After you feel like you've gotten the lyrics and the music down in a place that you like them, you create a demo, and depending on what your process is like, this might be the time that you send it to production. Now, you can ship this off to a producer where their job is to take a look at the song, possibly rearrange parts of it, streamline the song, add different elements, sound effects, things like that, textures and layers, anything that they can do to basically make the song as listenable and palatable as they can for audiences once the rough draft is finally done. You can take some of these production steps into your own hands, but more often than not, people will have another hand on deck for production. And in a way, it does really help, because you have a second brain in the room that can help bounce ideas off of you and maybe open you up to things that you hadn't thought of before. After the song is fully produced, it'll go into the recording stage. And this is a big moment for a lot of artists. Typically, although it's becoming a little bit less typical nowadays, you would go into a studio because they have the best equipment, right? They have really great audio gear, a lot of which can be very expensive. They'll set you up with really nice guitars, and possibly even elements like this tape machine that we'll talk about in a second. So you go in and you record it, and depending on how planned or prepared you are, you might have all the parts written out at this point and fully produced, or you might be using this time as a little bit of an experimental moment. You might try some different amps out, you might sing the song in a couple of different ways until you find something that you like, and save all of those pieces for the next stage. So you've fully recorded your song or your album, you have all the pieces. Well, what comes next? Hopefully you've done some editing on these tracks. When the sound engineers are in the audio booth recording you, depending again on who you work with, a lot of the times they're cutting and snipping and snapping things into place. And what that just means is you're taking audio files, you want to make sure that they're lined up. But the editing process is a very big one. So more than likely, the editing is going to be going on after you're done recording. This is a big step. To me, this is where I think the song or the album really comes alive, is in the editing. Not necessarily in the production, but once you have all the pieces together, lining things up into place, these subtle differences make such a huge impact on the song. You might need to correct some of the vocals, you might need to line up the timing on the different instruments, and you'll definitely need to go through comps, which is the process of picking the right take out of all of the ones that you took while you were in the vocal booth or in the guitar booth, and making sure you have the perfect take that will end up in the final track. Once you have all these tracks edited, it'll take you to the second to last step, which is mixing. And most people have heard that term before, but in general what it means, you have the tracks fully edited, you have them fully recorded, your production design is already there, so what does mixing do? Well, mixing is the process of making sure that every single piece of the song pops out in the right places and plays and works together really well. Mixing is like balancing the ingredients in a stew, right? You don't want too much salt, you don't want too much pepper, you don't want too many potatoes, that kind of thing. If your vocals are overshadowing a part of the song, a mixer's job is to check out different things like volume leveling and compression, panning, stereo image, and things like that that can really get the song sitting in the right place. a good rule of mixing is that you would like to be able to hear all of the elements that you recorded, obviously. There's some general rules of thumb. You're kind of using a spatial image of what it would be like to listen to this music if it were right in front of you. Your vocals sit right in front of you. You might have guitars on the left and right. The drums are usually right in front of you, and different elements will be panned around to create a 3D stereoscopic image that is sitting right and playing nicely together. This is the stage where you do things called equalization, and that means going through each of the frequencies of the instrument to make sure that the bass doesn't slash into the kick drum or the vocals don't slash into the guitar. So you need to make sure that you carve out spaces for each of these instruments so that they sit and play nicely together. Mixing is a very important stage and is basically the final step for you to make sure that everything is exactly the way that you want it in the song. This is why a lot of people charge good money to do mixing. This is a job that gets batted around to lots of different people. And if you're an independent artist, this is something that you're going to be paying the most money for. You're going to be paying for recording, of course, but provided that you've done the recording, mixing is the #1, most requested thing because it requires a very specific set of skills. And not a lot of artists know how to mix. It's almost two different worlds. So what's the final step? Well, the final step is mastering, and I feel like most people that are musicians understand what that is, but not a lot of other people really get what mastering is or what the point is. Well, mastering is the process of taking your fully mixed tracks, everything is completely sitting in the right place that you want, and bringing them up to the competitive level of other tracks that you might listen to on different platforms like Spotify and Apple Music, or back in the day with CDs and vinyls. You wanted to make sure that the tracks kind of had a listenable level of loudness that still allowed for a range in dynamics, aka you would like to hear a nice range between the softer parts of the song and the louder parts of the song, but at the same time you don't want them to be too disparate, because if you crank the track, then the loud parts will be really loud and the soft parts you'll be able to hear just a little bit. Mastering often uses a process of compression and even additional EQs to sort of level the track out and make it nice and loud to basically serve up to the audience. You can think of this step as the garnish on top of the stew. You've crafted it, you've created it, its flavors are all there, but you need to make sure that you bring this thing up to a professional level that everybody can enjoy and be impressed by. So the last step is very important. Now, if we look at all these steps, we have writing, producing, recording, editing, mixing, and mastering. I want you to think about that for a second and think that out of all 6 of those steps, as sort of broad categories, people will send their song, track, or album out to different people for every single step of that process. Now, not all the time, of course, right? Some people might do some of these themselves. They'll do the writing themselves, and they'll do this. They'll do the producing themselves to save themselves the trouble and the time. But even professional artists, you might notice, have multiple writers, multiple people on production. They go to the studio and the sound engineers there are there to record, etc., etc. So it's a lot of work to create an album and a song, and I think most people understand that, but just so it's all laid out for you, now you really get why. Well, there's all these different steps, and it can also get really expensive. I mean, imagine having to pay hundreds or thousands of dollars at each step of this process. Well, creating a song, track, or album, especially an album, can be incredibly expensive. And even as an independent artist, when I was working with the Crown Remnant band, we were spending upwards of 5 digits creating our own albums just on the work that we spent sort of sending out to other people. So as somebody that is not living in the wealthiest of circumstances, as most of us are in these days and times, I started to think to myself, well, what's the real purpose here? What's the real point? Why has music become so convoluted to the point where we have to send our tracks out to 18 different people, 9 different teams, just to get different parts of the processes done? Well, most people do that because they lack the skills, or they want to make sure that their stuff is good enough, and so they like bouncing their ideas off of other people. With enough experience in the industry, I decided that for myself, my biggest goal as an artist is to create music. My job here is to make stuff that I like and put it out for you. And every single thing that gets in the way of that really gets on my nerves. Rebirth is the first album where I took control of every single part of the process. I did the writing, the producing, the editing, the recording, the mixing, and the mastering all by myself. This is a humongous amount of work, but in a way, it's also very cathartic for me because it was a moment where I got to teach myself and learn a lot of these different steps of the album making process, and I've been picking up different tips and tricks as I've been recording throughout the years. This was a really big moment for me to learn and get in on the different parts of songwriting and writing so that ultimately I'm not held back by things like money, by things like disagreements, by things like too many cooks in the kitchen, or too much time spent in the hands of another person who maybe doesn't value the project as much as I did. And I run into all of these things in the industry, and frankly I'm just a little bit sick of it. So this is the results. This is what a guy like me does when I feel like I am unable to achieve my vision. I go out and I try to do it myself, put up the sleeves, and I get the hands dirty and that kind of thing. So if you're a musician listening to this, you understand the blood, sweat, tears, grit, and the thousands of hours, not a joke, that I've put into this over the last year to create this 11-track album, and it's something that I'm really proud of. So that's the introduction to this behind the scenes and sort of the reason why I want to do this. The album is called Rebirth because it is me sort of reimagining, reawakening my sound, and also it is my creative birth as a mixer, a sound engineer, a mastering artist, and really a producer, and trying to make these songs come to life completely as I see them in my head. Everything that you've listened to on this album, if you've heard it, or if you haven't, go take a listen, is 100% from me. There is nobody else to blame. I have all of the responsibility for this project, and that's something that I think I prefer. I will take all of the consequences if a song sucks, and I will take all of the gain if a song is really good, but no matter what, the good and the bad, what you hear on this record is fully me, and that's why it's called Rebirth. Rebirth is also a reimagining of my sound. This is a creative, alternative, eccentric, experimental album for me, and it allowed me to play with a lot of different unique concepts and sounds that you'll get into as you go through the track by track behind the scenes that I'm creating for you. Without further ado, let's get into it a little bit.